like we can just jump in.
Okay.
And so everyone is here for Games of Change, folks. Folks in the physical room, everybody, here we go. Everyone's here for Games for Change. We're good? All right. It's funny, there's so many layers of like virtuality going. So this is my, really excited to introduce Raul. He works, we met at the AWE conference, and he's worked, after working closely with the festival team at the 2018 Games for Change Festival. He's now the director of production and XR for Games for Change. He fuses his background in film production and virtual reality development to bring together talented teams that create memorable experiences. He coordinates the Game for Change team production efforts across all initiatives and manages the development and strategy for the XR for Change program. So everybody, welcome, Raul. Over here.
Hello, thank you so much, Zoltan. Great to have this time with y'all to participate. It's my first reality hack, so I've known it by reputation for a long time and excited to be here as a mentor. I gave a little bit of preamble earlier about what we're here to do. I'm just gonna do a quick screen share so that I can jump into some of that material. Let's see here. So, like Sultan said, my name is Raul Carvajal. I'm the Director of Production and XR for Change at Games for Change. For those of you that don't know us, we are a nonprofit that's based out of New York City. Our mission is to empower game creators and social innovators to drive real-world impact through games and immersive media. We do that in a bunch of different ways, which you can like read about here. But generally speaking, right, we bring together all sorts of audiences that are interested in making impact through interactive. That includes educators, other nonprofits, developers, consumers, researchers, right? Anyone who really believes in that mission has a home at Games for Change, and we serve kind of like a relatively unique position within all of those folks in that regard. And we purposely take like a very big tent approach when we talk about impact, right? We are not just focused on education or healthcare or civic and social issues. We talk about all of it. In 2017, we launched a subcategory of the org called XR for Change. I joined in 2018, so it was just shortly after its founding. And that was an effort to start folding in cutting edge immersive technologies like XR, virtual reality, augmented reality, these sorts of technologies, because we were seeing lots of lessons being learned. I think we had, as an org, like maybe 15 years of uphill battles trying to convince folks that games could be more than entertainment. And it was so enthusiastic, it was so wonderful to see like folks in the XR space in particular, even from like this early stage, starting to think about how can this work start impacting real world issues. So that was something we've been incubating here as a community of practice. I guess one thing that helps to sum this up pretty well is a quote from one of our partners over at Unity, Jessica Lindell, some of you may know. She said that XR has the greatest potential for deep engagement, deep empathy, and therefore better outcomes. XR touches on almost every issue of the modern world, from civic justice to racial equity to police brutality. If there's a cause, there's an XR experience that can unlock your imagination and break open your heart in new ways. And I totally agree with that. It really sort of encapsulates the mission that we have here at G4C and at XR4C. So what I want to do today, goals for this session in particular, just introduce this idea of impact design, what I mean by it, try to give you some nuance and color to it, as well as give you some starting steps, essentially, to start thinking about how you would make an impact project practically, and how do you start thinking about like the production of that thing. I want this to be collaborative, so definitely feel free to just like jump in at any point if you've got a question or something feels like it needs clarification. I'm all ears and not precious about my own time or speaking engagement. So feel free. Let's jump into it collaboratively. I'm also going to be jumping around to different decks, so you're going to have to excuse some aesthetic inconsistency here, but message-wise, it's all on point. So when I say impact design. This is physically what I'm talking about. It's a form of innovative design that leverages the power of interactive media like games and immersive experiences as tools for addressing social issues, right? At the very base level, that's what we're talking about. But here I've just listed a very small set of topic areas. When I say social issues, right, we're talking about systemic problems that require systemic solutions. Games and immersive media, which can just be like one piece of that, right? We're not necessarily saying here that our games or immersive experiences are going to be the literal solution to any of these systemic issues, but we do feel that they have power to affect those issues in powerful ways, right? So, next slide. When I mentioned the sorts of ways in which some of this stuff might impact a user or a community or a player, these are the different sorts of things I'm talking about, right? Building empathy, education and knowledge transfer, raising awareness about an issue, creating a social movement, developing citizen science platforms, instilling behavior change, developing some cognitive training within the user, right? All of these things are possible and have been demonstrated. These examples that I've listed here are just a few of the ones that can get you in and sort of starting to think about that sort of thing. But I tend to think about all of this on a spectrum, I suppose. So on the hard impact side, you can get something that's hyper specific and extremely localized. For example, right, I'm going to develop a mobile application that's going to be distributed in West Africa to help teach financial literacy to young kids, for example. Very focused, very localized, and the impact is extremely clear, right, in terms of like what they're hoping to achieve with that knowledge transfer experiential gain. On the soft side, and the opposite side of this spectrum, I mentioned things like soft impact. And those are projects that maybe don't even have a specific impact goal in mind when they're starting to be developed, but whose very existence does sort of push the needle and create some social impact with regard to raising awareness about an issue, or even just on the inclusivity side, right? Like seeing a story told in a different way, from a different perspective. Usually here we're talking about like minority voices, right? Minority authors who are jumping into the space and sort of redefining what a genre or story can be. Especially things like protagonists that we haven't seen in some of these pieces before, right? Or who aren't as popular as sort of the mainstream games that are more widely popular. All of that I still feel has high value, right? When we're talking about like the impact of that piece and the impact on the culture that that piece is moving into, right? So you can really place all of these sorts of different impact goals within this hard or soft spectrum, depending on how specific a creator wants to be with the outset. I'll mention that we developed a white paper at XR for Change called the XR for Social Impact Landscape. And we decided to just focus on 3 areas where we want to start talking about and introducing use cases around the 3 sort of like industrial pillars that we want to focus on. Here we've got healthcare, education, and workplace training. This was through a grant that we received from the New York Council on the Arts, and it was developed through a fellowship with 2 other co-writers, Noel Mazurek and Archer Kaushik, both of whom are lovely humans and are now out like in the world doing their own thing. We interviewed 25 creators or so across 50 XR applications and experiences. And the goal, right, was to basically answer the question or the perspective of folks who maybe have heard of XR being disruptive in a particular industry, but haven't necessarily understood the tactile how and why of that disruption, right? So in the healthcare space, we were showcasing experiences and use cases that enhance telehealth accessibility, reduce hospitalization times, helped with drug-free pain management, improved patient experience and personalization. in education, right? We were cultivating curiosity around immersive engagement, experiential transfer of knowledge, individualized learnings, resource scaling through digital environments, and in workplace training, enhanced skill assessment, technical and soft skill proficiency development, emergency disaster preparedness simulation, and decreased operational downtime and failure costs. So again, like this is a distillation of a lot of material that's in this white paper, but if you're interested in checking it out, I do think it serves as a nice primer and next step for folks who are thinking about impact work and just want to hear about some success stories that help really flavor and color those experiences. So definitely let me know if you want to learn more about that paper. I'll share it with folks at the end. You know, within those observations, I think we had some really key caveats, some of which are relevant to the rest of my discussion today, which is, you know, we've got a lot of issues, I think, in this space that don't necessarily stem from the issue areas of the systemic change that we're hoping to make with the tech, but it's sort of like inherent to the thing. Privacy, safety, and ethics, of course, like a massive conversation right now. I'm sure that there's going to be folks participating today who have like pretty strong feelings about these pieces. Also, hardware implementation costs, that's getting better, but certainly is not negligible, especially for many communities in the US. Infrastructure to support this sort of change is extremely important. We started by talking about internet, which is such a basic piece of this infrastructure that I think is important, but so many homes still do not have basic internet access. And I feel like this is an accessibility issue that is not necessarily talked about enough. And of course, you know, the content is king problem. You need creatives who can jump in here and sort of contextualize some of this work, not just on a technical level, but on a story level. And that's some of what we're going to talk about in our exercises later on. So with this, I'm going to pause my share, actually stop it altogether. And I'm going to move into my second deck here. Let's see. So at Games for Change, we've developed a couple of different frameworks and ways of thinking about impact design specifically. We do that for a couple of different people. You know, sometimes we're helping to introduce nonprofits to game design principles and really what it means to like make a game. Sometimes we're introducing game developers to the nonprofit world and what it means to like work with folks who are embedded in those issues. In either case, right, we're bridging the gap between those folks because we do feel it's very important to get those diverse perspectives in the room at the authorial level throughout the process so that they can basically maximize the impact of their piece. So I'm going to go through now just a couple of ways in which we've talked about impact design at the org and sort of tried to organize our thinking around what that means for our production. Here I've got a list of impact design principles, which we can step through, right? Not just as fun, or sorry, not just for fun and just as fun. I think fun is a thing that we've struggled to talk about historically, right? Because people hear games for change and automatically feel like there needs to be that automatic fun value because games are fun. And that's an assumption that many people carry. Of course, we know that games are more than just fun. Fun here is really just being used as engaging, right? As a synonym for engaging. So all this to say that like you don't just want your chocolate covered broccoli, right? It's got to be tapping into the same sort of like engagement principles that all these other entertaining products definitely do, and that drives a lot of success within the space. Impact creative alignment. You know, sometimes we've seen projects who have very strong impact goals, but are writing a script or creating a scenario or designing levels that really don't necessarily connect or align with the kinds of messages trying to be shared. And it's not to say that those things need to be like immediately one-to-one or analogous, but there certainly needs to be a strong connection between the impact area that you're trying to talk about and the creative representation of that thing over time. Sensitive to context is super key as well. I mentioned at the top that none of our games or prototypes or solutions in the XR space are going to totally eradicate a systemic issue on their own, likely. So that means that your piece is going to enter into a broader context of folks who are actively thinking about that issue and are actively thinking about how they can tackle it, right, and make it better. So folks who are developing within that impact sphere should be knowledgeable about it, right? This is where it really becomes helpful to have a subject matter expert that is part of the core team, as opposed to somebody that you just consult once with, maybe at the top or towards the end, even in a worst case scenario. The earlier you get that education or information, the easier it then becomes to really incorporate sort of best practices and best learnings that are up to date with folks who are in the space, and not just getting that from one source necessarily, right? Like you would ideally embed yourself with a community, and that community will also have nuance and difference within it that you can play off of and be informed by. I'll talk a bit more about this SME piece in a bit, but the translation from sensitive to context does turn into, hopefully, meaningful collaboration with experts, where those folks are embedded within your teams from an early stage, right, and who have equal stake in the game with the development of your piece. Leveraging partnerships is also part of this kind of like a community engagement side. It's also not totally likely that you will automatically have the exact avenues at the ready to get this piece in front of the people that would be benefited most by it. So you definitely want to research what sorts of partners might help you get there on a distribution level, but also folks who would potentially be able to fund it from an early stage, who would be able to maybe even fund the impact portions of this outside of the development, right? Because that's a totally different sort of line item in your budget when you think about touring, when you think about making kits for access, when you think about applying to festivals, right? All these other things are definitely a part of the solution sphere that partnerships can help with. And then, of course, measurable impact. Last but certainly not least, if you have an impact goal in mind and a question that you're hoping to answer, you should also essentially be able to measure the impact that your piece is making before and after its engagement, right? So it seems quite basic, but many folks falter here only because the ways in which you will measure your impact are totally tuned to exactly what kinds of question you're trying to ask or answer within the piece. So there is no one way to measure this impact. It's a mix of qualitative and quantitative material that you and your SMEs and your team will need to be sort of like the best judge on and really iterate on over time, because it's unlikely that you'll get it right the exact first time. But measuring that impact is extremely important to not just gauge your own success, but also to, you know, be a part of the process that iterates and expands on the thing over time. Hope that makes sense. We've created a couple of frameworks at Games for Change to talk through the production of these sorts of ideas. I'm going to talk about the G4C DEEP framework. DEEP stands for Discover, Execute, Evaluate, and Pay It Forward. We also have an 8-step methodology at the organization, which is essentially the same steps, but just contextualized differently. I find that this way of thinking helps translate it a bit better for technical folks who maybe already have some sort of production experience within the thing. So we'll talk about it that way. Here's the framework in its entirety and in its textual glory. Discover, we've got 4 steps, right? So we're trying to describe the problem, understand the audience needs, define your impact goals, and tap into expert networks. From there, we can move on to execution and production, essentially, designing with intention, diversifying your execution strategy, diversifying your monetization, evaluate with measure, evaluate, and optimize as part of the iterative piece of the puzzle, and then paying it forward, giving back to the community to amplify impact on a larger scale and ensure that you're not doing this work in isolation and that folks can folks who helped you get to where the piece is can also be benefited by it. So I'll step into a couple of these now, right? So when I say describe the problem, this is like core to your piece, right? You need to be as specific as possible. You can't just make a piece about climate change necessarily, right? It helps to hone that into a very specific sort of nuanced angle, only because that specificity will lend way more character, I think, to the end product. And also, right, when we talk about systemic issues, we recognize that those issues are not necessarily just one question or one issue, right? So within the system, which particular angle of the system are you trying to tackle with your piece? This getting specific here is helpful and difficult. So at the beginning of your journey, even like today, for instance, right, if y'all are thinking of making a prototype through the hack that is impact oriented, it will likely be somewhat hard to like start trimming down what you want your exact impact to be or what you want this question to be. But if you put in the work for that particular question, I promise you it will pay dividends. You don't need all the answers right now, but certainly start like just getting more specific so that you can at least have lines of questioning that would lead you towards more answers in the future. I've got an exercise and a series of worksheets that I'll pass out at the end of this, which will definitely be helpful for folks who are thinking through some of this stuff more actively and just want somewhere to start their thinking for the jam specifically. I've also got here understanding audience needs, another core piece of the puzzle, right? So one piece of this is meeting your audience where they're at. Like what is your audience's relationship to the issue that you're talking about? How familiar are they with games or XR? What kind of access do they have to that technology? And if there isn't ready access, right? Like how are you as a creator accounting for that? Are you making is this the sort of like answer to the question that would dissuade you from doing like a full 6-stop experience versus a web VR experience, for example, right? Also understanding context is something I mentioned a bit earlier as well, right? Where and how are your audience members interacting with the problem and with your project? Those two things might have separate answers. And then also thinking, about the auxiliary folks that help support that experience, i.e. like, do you need a facilitating educator, right? Is this the sort of experience or piece that really would benefit from having a guide throughout the thing, as opposed to a standalone thing that I could just download on my phone and walk through on my own? Each of those has very practical, the answers to each of those questions have very practical impacts on your bottom line, like when it turns to both effort and money spent on this impact portion. So definitely don't underestimate it, right? Defining your impact goals is another piece that we've got some material to help you with. Again, you want measurable change that positively addresses your problem. Sometimes you know what the problem is, but we may not always enter into it with a lot of information about what those solutions are. So it does take somewhat of a nuanced approach to try and think about how might somebody answer or tackle this thing effectively, and how am I gauging the effectiveness of that thing? You should definitely assume that subject matter experts will help you define these goals. You should not, as a creator, necessarily like automatically know, like, here's the question I'm trying to solve, and here's my solution to that thing that is purely based off of like my own experience. You very well may have some experience that is super valuable to start honing in on the issue. I would encourage you to gut check those assumptions with the rest of the community who's actively thinking about these things, maybe in a more deep way than you have been. Embracing a scientific mindset, I think, shouldn't be understated either. Definitely is important to think about the data, especially the data that exists outside of your piece versus the data that will kind of be inherent within the play and the piece that you will eventually create, right? If you think about all of that information and how it's ultimately going to translate into a story of change, that is very difficult if you're not starting to think about it scientifically, if you're starting to think about it rigorously, is maybe another word that we can use here. So definitely encourage those pieces in there as well. Finally, tapping into expert networks. I've mentioned this, right? But you don't just want to incorporate your SME at the end. You want them as a core part of the team if you can, right? Like find somebody who's passionate, not just about the issue, but also who's like open to thinking about like this space specifically and what's exciting about XR and trying to evaluate, right, how that opportunity can open up some doors for the issue and tackling some of the solutions that maybe they're a bit more passionate about as well. Definitely let them gut check your assumptions. Have them verify your theory of change, right? You may have an assumption about, okay, well, if my player goes through my piece, they will come out of it with X, Y, and Z because they have done the thing that I have made for them. Sometimes that's true, and most times it isn't. So you want to verify that the theory of change that you've built into your design is actually valid and it's kind of like backed up by modern thinking around the thing. Certainly contextualize your project in relationship to the standards of the industry. That's a very important one, particularly to gain more partners. I will say that your SMEs are kind of the first step in building external partnerships. They are essentially kind of an external partnership that we are trying to fold into an internal partnership. And it can be quite helpful to have or hear those folks recontextualize the work that you're trying to do in the way that maybe they would describe it to their colleagues, right? Because sometimes that sort of code switch doesn't necessarily feel supernatural, but can be important to just make sure that there's another way of talking about your piece that would translate potentially more effectively with external partners. So certainly think through that sort of context and see what you might gain there. I'm going to pause. This is sort of like technically the end of like my talk piece. I can talk through the rest of the framework that I've got here for you, but I want to mention that I've got some worksheets that I'll be able to pass along, which cover and give everybody steps, sort of like questions and boxes. This will bring you to like a Google Slides presentation with a bunch of boxes that you can fill out. Feel free just to like duplicate it, make a copy, and fill it out for yourself. It's actually based off of a workshop that we offered to Ukrainian developers actually the last 2 years. As we started this in 2020 and 2021. And that was a wonderful experience where we got to meet about 100 or so developers and teach and really exchange game design principles and impact design principles. So these worksheets are based off of that work. You may see a serious games developer program in Ukrainian up on the top right. That's why that's there. Definitely wishing the folks in that region a lot of well wishes at the moment. So I'll post this link in chat. Also for folks that don't want to pull up the bit.ly. And I'll send it to Sultan as well so he can pass it around to folks who are in person as well. So feel free to check that out. We'll step through it in a second. Just to move through the rest of the deep impact design work here. Designing with intention. Here, I'm really talking about aligning your impact definition with the creative choices that you're making, right? So this is that impact creative alignment that I mentioned during the values. Your game definitely still needs to be compelling and engaging piece of work on its own. And all of the impact work that you've done previous to that will color it and make it more engaging, certainly. Definitely need to think about like how you weigh your production value against impact, only because both of those things take a lot of time, energy, and work. It helps to have more folks on the team who are kind of like delineated and delegating each of these portions to. For instance, Games for Change has just executive produced a piece that was at South by Southwest called On the Morning You Wake to the End of the World. This is a virtual reality documentary that's talking about nuclear threat from the perspective of Hawaiians who in 2018, millions of whom in the state received a text message that said, take cover, you're about to get hit by a nuke. And for almost 40 minutes, thought that they would perish. So we're using testimonies from those folks to talk about global nuclear security threat, and had totally distinct sort of members of this team thinking through this design from their own perspectives, right? So we had the core sort of technical and creative team in Archer's Mark and Atlas V. They're based out of the UK and France. We had our academic team, subject matter experts, folks from the Office of Global Nuclear Security at Princeton, who were the first ones to bring this project to us and who certainly provided the academic and practical and industry perspective on this issue. And then there was Games for Change. We came in as EPs to like help link those two sides of the puzzle, but also think through the impact campaign. So we just launched at South by Southwest, won the jury prize for XR experience there, and released all 3 of our chapters. But that's just the beginning of like the impact work that is rolling out, and that work has been developed over the course of the last year or so. And we've got folks who are literally just thinking about the impact side, both from a production standpoint, but also from like a theoretical standpoint when it comes to the actual content that we're sharing within some of those impact goals. So we're developing classroom curricular material, we're developing events with particular folks in the community, developing strategy around which government agencies or individuals we're engaging with to show the piece to help instill some fire and change there as well. So all that to say that you need to weigh that production value against the impact that you're trying to have, only because it will take time to really push all of those things equally. And your team should be reflective of that work so that it's not all being tackled by the same human or by the same humans. Moving on to diversifying your execution strategy. Kind of mentioned this a little bit in my description for On the Morning You Wake, but you're hoping to identify and plan for partners that are going to share this widely and wildly, potentially. These are the folks that are going to be kind of like your champions, right? Not just your core supporters financially, potentially, but also the folks that are going to get this thing out there. Helps to connect with folks who have distribution in mind, as opposed to just being passionate about your space and wanting to fund it. That's great. But if you have people who have existing connections to actually get your piece in front of the folks that will benefit from it, that's even better. Iterative workflows. This is like what we're starting here at the Hack, right? Want you to prototype always, cheaply, early, often. Do it as much as you can. You're gonna have assumptions, even ones that you think are well informed by the community, and it's not until you actually like try some of that stuff out and stand it up that you can really evaluate its worth. So I encourage you to really think about iterating always, and not just think about your development sort of like in one arc. Think that kind of in like in a circular rounds. I would also ask you to consider non-traditional development timelines, right? Like there's a lot of folks maybe who are even coming from like a traditional media background who like need to get their script 100% ready before they can move into production. And then once they're in production can move into post-production, right? But as we know, the things on these engines and in these technical pipelines are infinitely more iterative than that, and not necessarily as clean 1, 2, 3. So definitely try to cycle as much of this as you can, and just get to like get to the core thing that your gut is sort of like leading you to, such that you can get it out and get it in front of others who can evaluate it and circle it back. Diversifying monetization. This is a big question. This slide is kind of talking about game dev specifically, but I think it still applies to kind of the XR space. We know that game dev and some of this XR development is also very expensive. You'll be certainly adding costs to your project by making it an impact project because of all the things that I've said. Your budget for your impact goal should be something that you budget for at the top, right? And maybe those are just some assumptions that will need to be reevaluated later on and iterated on, but you should definitely start there as opposed to thinking like, okay, cool, well, I'm just gonna like make the thing and then I'll tack on the impact piece later. That almost always is a recipe for failure because it will not create as deep of an engagement as you would like, I think, ultimately. Creating pilot experiences cheaply to secure more funding is a great sort of tried and true thing here, especially in the impact space, right? Like the folks who are most likely to fund your piece are definitely looking for ways to taste it and to see really what you mean, because very likely they will not be technical humans or even game or XR humans who are familiar with the sort of space that you're developing within and really want to understand the story that you're telling, really want to understand the impact you're trying to make, really want to understand the team that you're putting together to try and make this vision real. So pilot experience is super helpful. Another word for this is like a vertical slice, right? You will more than likely need multiple sources of funding, including grants, donors, VCs, sponsors, all of the above. Get it wherever you can. And don't underestimate one thing versus another, right? In particular, grants. Like this is one thing that we're seeing a lot more of in this space historically, I would say like over the last 2 or 3 years, like just many, many more grants, not just for not just for projects that are meant to tackle a particular issue, but also folks who are just kind of diversifying the author pool that they're supporting, right? So you've got many more funds and grants now for Black developers, some funds now for Latinx developers as well. I encourage you to be creative with the kinds of sources that you're looking for here, only because it will all sort of bleed into hopefully your project in a way that's beneficial. Family foundations are also one that can be big wins, right? Like if you happen to tap into a family foundation that is adjacent or even deeply invested in the project space that you're in, those folks are almost always looking for like innovative ways to donate their money and support projects like these. So think through those as well. Measure, evaluate, and optimize. I mentioned this, I won't harp on it, but don't leave it as an afterthought, right? Like how are you measuring the impact? Who is measuring the impact on your team? Do you have flexibility to change that approach based on the information that you end up gathering? And you know, if something's not working, definitely cut it. That's a part of the iterative roadmap that we're laying out for each other. Getting back to the community, I don't want to understate either, right? Track your progress however you can. That can be a talk with an organization or with a group of humans. That can be a blog that you're putting out on your website, right? That documentation is core, not just to the folks that are going to interact with the piece, but more so for the folks that will be inspired by your piece and want to make a similar impact, right? These sort of development oriented stories can really lend a lot of information to somebody who's just trying to kickstart and jump in. So think about paying that forward and boosting the ecosystem around you. Identifying and participating in communities, convenings in your issue ecosystem, I think is also important, right? Like once you've made the piece, you hopefully can give it away to folks to check it out and whatever that means. So you'll see this sort of tension pop up in terms of, well, I've made this 6.VR experience that requires a particular kind of setup, and I want to make sure that that experience is manicured into a particular standard? How can I ensure that at scale, right, with different folks in the communities that I'm targeting, potentially students at the college level, potentially academics who have like their own sort of conferences, right? Now you're talking about a tour that can be quite expensive quite quickly if you're not developing sort of like mobile kits that can be shipped off. And even then, like that, you're only minimizing your costs so much, right? So again, there are core costs attached to those things, but the participation in the community is invaluable, right? Because not only does it hopefully benefit folks, but it's also lending an authentic voice to you as a creator to ensure that, hey, I want to get this out there, and I'm not just trying to like keep it in this isolated space that is totally removed from the actual community that is struggling with this issue. And reporting back, I think, is like a different way of thinking about that, right? Not just like the events and communities and getting it in there, but just opening lines of dialogue with other nonprofits, mentorship opportunities for folks that maybe are inspired by your work and would love to support it more actively. That stuff is definitely something you can start taking advantage of quite early, actually. And you can definitely see like this development blogs and reporting back to community as something of a link here. Okay, so that's the framework. Again, I will I'm just going to recircle back to the actual link that I made earlier with the worksheets and just I'll just like scroll through those with y'all here real quick. It is, again, something that you should be able to use as like an agnostic tool, I suppose. So we've got, the first stop is just like an impact puzzle. If you're thinking about a impact project today for the hack, start there, right? Like, what is the piece? If you don't have an impact prompt, there's a little exercise here for you to maybe connect an issue with an impact goal. You could replace, these dies for any of the things that you've got particular passion for, certainly. Write the issue that you're hoping to take on and what intervention attempt you're going to be making with that thing. And then we break down the discover part of our framework and ask you to get some specificity here with the issue and how you want to address it. Some questions here that really help you hone in on the audience that you're hoping to tackle. And then really designing your impact goal, weighing out different options for those goals and seeing how they might actually bubble up. I encourage like multiple people in your group to sort of like fill these out together so that you can at least start a discussion about what that means. And then of course, tapping into your expert networks, right? This is something that hopefully you can start leveraging even at the hack level by just sending a quick email to somebody who might give you the time of day and take a quick call, or might be willing to join the hack more broadly. There are a couple of other ones here in terms of the design, right? Again, just like some initial prompting to make it very specific for you as you move on. So I hope that that's helpful. I'm happy to take any questions that y'all might have. Otherwise, I'm going to be in the Discord with everyone and very excited to participate alongside y'all, help however I can.
Do you have any questions? Specific questions? Yes. So the question is, how do you make sure that you're still keeping the game engaging and fun, even though it's sort of focused on like the social perspective?
That's a great question.
Like any tips?
I'll say that the easiest way to start gauging this for me has just been to like play the stuff, right? So like see what's out there and what you find personally engaging, and start thinking a bit more critically about like, okay, well, why do I keep wanting to play this, or why am I pulled to play this thing or interact with it in a particular way? It's unfortunately somewhat common to sometimes play like an impact-oriented piece and kind of feel talked down to, or feel like you're being condescended to, or infantilized in some way. None of that stuff is particularly fun or engaging, right? So the thing that you want to do, hopefully, is think about the issue and your impact goal and try to match that to some sort of like mechanic or to some sort of action, right? That really takes advantage of the affordances of the medium that you're working in. And in that way, you're starting to think about the game first, that is informed by the impact that you're trying to have. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Do you have any tips for connecting with professional networks other than cold call email?
You mean, he said, any tips for connecting to like a professional network outside of just like a cold call email? You mean like trying to connect with like a social impact network, or
like psychologists or neuroscientists?
He said like, did you catch that? Like psychologists or neuroscientists?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of different ways that we've found successful as an organization, that the teams that we've featured have found successful. Number one, don't undersell the cold call email, because that actually has a pretty high hit rate with these sorts of folks. Generally speaking, like a researcher is getting, depending on their work and how popular I suppose it is, or how visible it is to the populace, they're almost always very happy to take time with folks to talk through this issue, especially if you're offering it from a perspective like, hey, look, like I'm adjacent, I'm very passionate about this thing, I'm looking to have an impact on it through some of the technology, would love to take some time just to hear a bit more about your work, and for you to maybe even hear about my ideas for why a collaboration might be helpful. And maybe that's not even where you're leading, right? Like maybe you just want to know more about the thing. I think really just positioning yourself as a creator at the outset and being very authentic with kind of your current positioning within the problem space just makes it very easy for somebody to say yes or no and kind of determine whether or not they're the right person to talk to you. Other than that, increasingly, right, I'm finding more opportunities for these sorts of people to get together like explicitly and like find more collaboration opportunities. I think this is one of them. But later on this year, every year as part of the Games for Change Festival, we host the XR Brain Jam, which is a weekend-long hackathon where we're pairing together specifically SMEs and XR game devs to make a prototype that's relevant to their research practice. And again, like that's the entire idea around the event. And so we're explicitly recruiting not just from the development side, but also from like the community member, subject matter expert area. And I'm seeing more and more of those kinds of jams happen. And it's a great just like community access point for you to make a connection and start hearing some folks.
What else? No, and so on a similar note, this year we actually have 4 community partners, actually. So kind of our own SMEs that are going to be here. So they're going to be doing a quick presentation right at the start of the dinner. That's going to be at Kresge. So one of them, IFP, is a youth program in the Cambridge area. It's called Innovators for Purpose. They work with middle and high school students, predominantly lower income Black and brown students, to engage them with technology. And so they're actually going to pitch 3 ideas to you guys that they are really excited to talk about. We've been working on them a bit. And so, yeah, so the kids are all coming to campus in about 2 hours, and then they'll get to hang out at the expo, and then they're going to pitch ideas. And then different teams will be able to form to like actually work on their idea with the mentors from their youth program. One of whom is a graduate, has gone to college, and is now here as a participant at the hackathon, and they're an amazing group of kids. You'll be blown away. The second is AR Cloud. They're doing open access to doing sort of city-based AR. And so they'll be talking, and then one of them is Big Rock Creative. They built the world for Burning Man and the interactive space. So they're trying to think critically after having Burning Man online, for the last 2 years, how do you come back into community? So specifically a community as unique as Burning Man. That's about a place, that's about a sort of almost like temporary physical world that you're in. What does it mean to use XR? So they built this whole alt space world. And so, and actually Athena is speaking at 3:30 about that. And so they're looking for folks to help them think through some of the ideas for designs that they have for this year's Burning Man, to use XR and on a deep level to maintain your existing sort of community vibe, but then also add to what has happened in the last 2 years of COVID when you come back together. So you have 3 chances to put all of this stuff into practice, and hopefully some of you guys join one of those teams and help design something for their sort of community challenge. But thank you guys, give Raul a round of applause. Thank you so much. I'll make sure to post, and one of the things we're gonna do later is for each of the events, we're gonna create like a Discord for the speakers to be able to share. So it'll be a separate channel on Discord, and then they can share their PowerPoints, they can share links. So then you'll just basically be able to go through the schedule as it is, and then get access to not just his workshop, but any of the workshops you've been going to today.
Rad.
You're
yeah,
also gonna
happy to share all that.
Awesome. All right, thank you guys. Thank you everyone.
Bye everyone, good luck.
Thanks, Raul.
Soon.
I'll be in touch, buddy.
All right.
And yeah, and so sorry for